Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today we're going to talk about Star Trek Picard Episode 9, Et in Arcadia Ego, Part 1. So in our last episode, Picard and the group were headed from Nepenthe to Soji's planet of origin, and this is where we start in episode 9. So in this episode, they arrive early, and we get to go ahead and see some major turbulence in space as Soji and the crew take essentially like a Borg conduit all the way into her home planet. And they ride that all the way in, and another Borg cube comes out behind them as well. So this kind of looks like really bad news bears for the crew, and also, like, again, hubris has gotten the best of some of our characters and thinking they could slip through the Borg conduit without anyone in the collective noticing and following them to Soji's home planet. So it's really interesting to watch them go through this turbulence in space, and particularly as it relates to that conduit, which acts as kind of a wormhole. And then we also have Agnes freaking out under a table, just really wanting it all to be over. Keep in mind, this girl murdered a man not that long ago, but she is very fearful of life herself, or of death, I suppose, and is just freaking out underneath this table, you guys. Rios and Picard both really have their stuff together, and they are trying to just keep it together, get through the turbulence, and maintain a sense of calm so that anyone else like Agnes, who is downright losing it, can also feel calm. And you see their Starfleet training in that as well. Soji is looking really excited, though, and happy to be home. And, you know, that's really not that weird. She doesn't really know her place in the universe, and just like Thad had that concept of his own home world, Soji is actually finally going to get to see hers. So this is a really big moment for her, and even though there's turbulence, she has been through so much lately, she's not really concerned with that. And she's just happy to see a little bit more about who she is as a person. And it's also really hard to tell why she looks so happy, though, because she shouldn't really know at this point what's on the other side of this. She seems like really jazzed about it, but it doesn't really come across as though she's part of a collective or anything like that, where proximity might make a big change for her. So we'll see what is going on in that respect. Next, though, I want to talk about the title of this work. So this is a 2-part episode, and Et in Arcadia Ego really is thought to stand for even in Arcadia, there am I, with the I referring to death, and Arcadia meaning any utopian land. So even in utopia, death is there, is essentially what it is believed to translate to. So this is from a painting by the artist Nicolas Poussin, and it was published, or produced rather, in 1637 to 1638. And he was the lead painter of the classical French Baroque style. And in this painting that is called, even in Arcadia, There Am I, there are just some shepherds hanging out in a field together. It looks really chill, like they're having a great day, and it's just a really idyllic scene as well. And they are also just hanging out outside of a tomb, you guys. Just a rock or some type of brick tomb is what it looks like in the painting. And they have this painting in the Louvre. So this concept of Et in Arcadia ego is referring to how death is still even in paradise, which is very interesting. As we discovered with the episode Nepenthe, these episodes do have a lot of thought put into their names, and sometimes there are some keys in interpreting the episodes within the names. It's one of my favorite things about Star Trek. So this is just a type of painting that Nicolas Poussin did, and it's really getting to the point that the person who was buried in the tomb lived in Arcadia became the new interpretation, and that was put forth by his biographer. But they have generally gotten to the point that the original interpretation, where ego refers to death, so even in paradise there is death, is considered to be the most likely interpretation that was intended by the artist for the painting. However, either way, it is meant to kind of set up an ironic contrast between how chill and happy everyone else seems to be in the picture and the shadow of death that also accompanies the tomb. I thought it was very interesting to read about that, and the concept of Arcadia has been present throughout history in a lot of different contexts, in paintings as well as in writing. It is interpreted in different ways, but overall, most folks tend to interpret it that death will even be present in paradise, more or less. And this type of symbol is called a memento mori in the art world. It's Latin for remember that you must die, and it's really supposed to be a symbolic reminder that death is inevitable. And while that on its face may not seem like much, when we remember that Captain Rios is reading Miguel de Unamuno's tragic sense of life, and that is the whole point, that man is aware of the inevitability of death, and that is part of what causes so much anxiety and consternation in humans, this very human drive to think about the concept of death in different contexts. And so it really does wrap in very well with the theme of the show overall, and it gives us a bit of foreshadowing too. This expression, memento mori, actually developed as Christianity grew because it emphasized heaven, hell, and salvation of the soul in the afterlife. So it fit in really well with not just different types of art, but also in religious movements. It is really meant to say remember or to die, which means remember death or remember that you will die. So this goes all the way back in use to Plato and Socrates and Seneca and some 2nd century Christian writers as well. It's a very old type of phrase and a very old type of application to the arts, which is rather interesting in my opinion. So we have this concept of et in Arcadia ego, even in paradise, death is here, and also the concept of the memento mori, so to remember that death is inevitable as well as Miguel de Unamuno's tragic sense of life. So this is a really death-heavy themed episode, you guys, and I did not necessarily see that going in. That's one of my favorite things about Star Trek, is they really know how to bury the lead so that you get a really great surprise in the storytelling. And this episode is no exception. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk some more about this concept of death in Arcadia Ego Part 1 and what it looks like as Soji and the rest of the crew of the La Sirena get close to her home planet. Stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Before the break, we were introducing the opening of episode 9 of season 1 of Star Trek Picard, Et in Arcadia Ego, and discussing how that title and its reference to death even in utopia, as well as it being a memento mori in comparison with Miguel de Unamuno's tragic sense of life, really gives us a well-rounded picture of what to expect and what the theme is really weaving into at this point in the show. So next, we are going to talk about their arrival near Soji's home planet. So as we get closer to the home planet, and as Soji goes through and gets more of her memories back over time, and or perhaps proximity, Soji is learning things like the name of her planet is Coppelius. So she knew at some point what this place was. She had prior knowledge. So it may have been a mind wipe, or maybe she was also perhaps made 3 years ago. It could be both, for all we know. So that introduces an interesting concept, though, because before now we were all just figuring Soji was only 3 years old and technically had just been programmed to have all of those memories. That may still be true, but the fact that she's starting to remember where she's going as she gets further back home and as we progress in time, I think really suggests that she also could have had a mind wipe at that point. It's a very interesting concept, and it gives us more information to work with. And also a lot more questions, like who would have wiped her mind, and why might they have done that? And did they give her new artificial training / programming on top of that? We're going to see where they go with this, but I think it's a really neat concept that they introduced just by having her remember something very small on the way back to her planet. But as they progress and they come out of the wormhole / the Borg conduit that they had been using, they have to deal with the fact that Narek has reappeared. So remember, they lost him for a while when Agnes went ahead and took the hypo spray that would neutralize the tracer that was inside of her, allowing Narek to follow him. But Narek has found them again and is kind of getting into a dogfight with them when they end up coming up against these giant space orchids. And the flowers are very beautiful, but they literally just look like the giant flowers of an orchid. And it reminds you of the other scenes from the show in which there are a lot of orchids and how that's kind of a symbol for a lot of these synthetic life forms that Bruce Maddox and the others were really working on at that point, and how he named orchids after them, Soji and Dodge. Dodge told us that early on, that their father named an orchid after them, or he named them after an orchid. I don't quite remember now. But they're created in pairs and everything as well. So we have these giant space orchids, and they're absolutely gorgeous, and it's just continuing the theme and the symbolism from earlier in the show. But it also is really fantastical in a way, and I love how it feels a little bit closer to Star Trek Discovery at that point too. It is very creative that they elected to use these orchids, and I like that it is also plant-based in a way. Not just because of the taxonomic implications and the implications about how their father was studying the genetics in orchids, how a lot of geneticists over the years have studied all types of genetics by looking at some plants and everything and manipulating their genes. If you major in biology or have any biology classes in general, they tend to talk to you about dominance in genes. So that has largely been illustrated in numerous textbooks with pictures of these flowers and how you can have incomplete dominance. And so sometimes you end up with speckled plants versus having a plant that has solid colors because you have spliced it together and one has dominated the other. So the father of modern genetics, of Mendelian genetics, Gregor Mendel, really worked on pea plants for the most part. And he found that each gene in those cases came in only two versions, two alleles, and it was very clear which allele was dominant, and that dominance was complete. So it totally overrode anything that was going on in the recessive allele to make sure that it was what was being expressed in the plant. So the genotype, that gene or that allele, is the genetic component, and the phenotype is what it looks like. So we found over the years, especially in studying more plants, that not all alleles are really a clear-cut dominance relationship. So not all of them are going to have a dominant allele that completely overrides the recessive one. Sometimes they may not completely hide the other one when you have a heterozygous relationship. So when you have one dominant and one recessive gene. And there are oftentimes many different alleles of a specific gene in a population, instead of just having those two choices of that one fully dominant one and the one fully recessive one. So the way that these genes come together really determines how you look. And so with these, we found other types of issues like incomplete dominance. And in that case, if you have one red gene and one white gene for this flower, then you are going to have a pink flower. So it's incompletely dominant. You are kind of seeing expression of both at that point. So it's not fully overriding the recessive gene. And then sometimes you can have codominance. And that's when you have both alleles simultaneously expressed in a heterozygous relationship of these genes. So you have two of them, and they're not necessarily dominant and fully recessive. They're codominant at this point, and they're both going to be expressed. However, unlike incomplete dominance, in which one tends to blend with the others. So there is the red gene and the white gene, and it makes it fully uniformly pink. In the case of codominance, both are getting expressed the same, and they are not mixing. So sometimes with codominance, that's when you'll see speckled flowers, like if you've ever seen a speckled orchid. And that's also how in humans the ABO blood group means that if you have an A allele and a B allele, then you have blood type AB, whereas some folks have 2 copies of an A, and so they have type A blood, and so on and so forth. Lastly, another thing that can change how you end up looking, your phenotype, can be that there are more than 2 different alleles for each gene. This is called multiple alleles. So individual humans can have 2 alleles for any given gene, but multiple alleles as options may exist at the population level, and different folks can have different pairs of those alleles. Additionally, we're going to talk about a gene that controls what color some rabbits tend to be, and it's called the C gene for our example. And with the C gene, it comes in 4 different types. One is black or brown fur. One results in a grayish type fur. Another one is more of like the seal point patterning that you see with Himalayan and Siamese cats a lot. And then you have the albino, which is just a pure white coat as well. So these different alleles, because there's 4 of them, have different dominance relationships. So for this case, the black allele is totally dominant to all of the others. That's going to be the large C. The chinchilla allele, that gray one, is incompletely dominant to the Himalayan and albino types, and the Himalayan is completely dominant to the albino allele. So if they have 1 Himalayan allele and 1 albino allele, the resulting baby is going to look entirely Himalayan, so that seal point type of look. In regards to that, if the chinchilla allele and the Himalayan allele are combined, it is going to get blended. It's incompletely dominant at that point, not codominant. So they may be gray, like a really dark gray, and also have that seal point look to them because it will be blended. Also, the chinchilla allele is incompletely dominant to the albino allele. So they may end up being a very light gray in that case. But if you have 1 copy of the black C allele, it is completely dominant to all the others, no matter the type. And so that is going to also dictate the color of your bunny rabbit and how that is going to be expressed. A lot of people who breed rabbits figured out how these relationships work in their genetics and what colors they would get by crossbreeding rabbits of different genotypes and observing the phenotypes of the ones who were born, because they would be heterozygous, having these different parents at this point. I think it's really interesting in how that works, and the rabbit understanding and the explanation is a great way to put it, but it works very similarly with plants, and I often see it done with orchids as well. So codominant orchids would have the speckles on them, and incompletely dominant orchids would have a blend of a color to them. You also might have a complex of it from having multiple alleles. All right, we're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about how Picard and everyone land and what happens next.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the concept of different types of dominance in genetics and how we are referencing that with this episode as we are seeing the orchids, and that is largely a symbol for the sense in these episodes, specifically the type who were all born from positronic cells that were derived from data. So in addition to this, there is a lot to also know about orchids and the name of this planet, Coppelius. In fact, if you don't know much about orchids, about 70% of them are epiphytic. And that means that they grow on top of another plant. Epi meaning on top, like your epidermis is the top layer of your skin. And phyte means plant, so plant on top. So the relationship that they have with their host plants that they're growing on top of is not actually harmful. So there are actually a couple of different relationships that parasites can have with hosts. And we tend to look at most of them as being parasitic. Most host relationships are considered to be parasitic because it's harming the host. But you can also have a symbiotic relationship or a mutualistic relationship. And that means that both the host plant and the plant that's growing on top of it are benefiting. But you can also have a commensalist type of relationship. And that's where one benefits and the other party is neutral. So in this case, that would be the humans and the synths. Or rather, not the humans. That's to put that into a very anthropocentric context. And it's not really about humans, but rather about the organics and the inorganics. But the organic life forms are an allegory, I believe, for humanity in general. So you get where I'm coming from. But in this case, we are seeing that the term commensalism also comes from the Latin term for sharing a table. And that is more or less what we're hoping is going to happen in this episode. Soji is going to be able to be reunited with her people, and everyone is going to share a table in this era in which synthetic life forms and synthetic research and all are totally banned, to the point that Deanna and Riker's son Thad could have survived a rare disease he had if they had been allowed to have access to the positronic research that was banned following the attack on Mars by the synths. So this is a very real issue that Picard is walking into, where he's about to share a table with these folks whose existence is illegal according to the Federation. And so we are yet again underscoring the measure of a man, and we're also doing so through this understanding of orchids and commensalism. It tells us quite a bit. So in this case, the synths and the humans are rather in a commensalistic relationship. There's not much that the synths can get from the humans that is going to benefit them. But also, not much is really going to hurt them as long as they're not enslaved. And that does not seem to be where this is going. So in that case, the humans tend to benefit from it, and it is neutral, really, for the sense. It doesn't really hurt them to help, but it also doesn't help them a whole ton to help. So they have a commensalistic relationship. And that's all that the synths are really trying to do at this point, is kind of get a seat at the table. So orchids are very interesting plants that grow way up in the tops of the forest canopy to get better light, and that tends to protect them from creatures that might eat them on the forest floor, because if you can't get to it, you can't eat it, right? So they're really beautiful, and they cohabitate with these other plants up at the top of the canopy. They also have to find a way to attach themselves to their hosts. And they don't have their roots planted in the soil because they're at the top of the canopy in a forest. So they need to find support and also a method for taking up moisture and nutrients. So this type of plant, largely known as epiphytes, are pretty common in areas like the tropics. They are able to climb up those trees and still really thrive because tropical forests are such humid environments. So they can get water and nutrients from just the dust and the moisture in the air because it is so damp. I think that's really cool. They're clearly very resilient creatures in very many ways. And they're able to absorb moisture just generally from their surrounding environment. So they are not going so far as to say that the synths in this case can perform cam photosynthesis or anything like that per se, but they are getting to the fact that these creatures are very resilient, that the organic synths we're seeing are very resilient, and you're seeing a lot of the genetics inspiration from the people who have created them, as well as their evolutionary types of inspiration in the form of Charles Darwin. I see a lot of Darwin and a lot of Mendel in here. And it's absolutely delightful how much they have thought their way through this in regard to physics and the biology of it. It's still sci-fi, but I really enjoy the amount of effort they put into this. Now that we've covered the orchids and their symbolism and how orchids do bind themselves with their roots and such to things that are high up in the air, their host trees, we do see that happen in Star Trek Picard as well. So folks may have been wondering why these flowers seem to essentially reach out and grab the ships and everything as well. Like, why would that be their mechanism? Why would someone design it that way? Well, that's what orchids naturally do as well. So it's just zapping all of the electricity from them after it wraps its way around it. So it's potentially taking life from it, but I believe that it's just meant to neutralize the ships, and they've noticed that their orchids in the lab do that. So it very much is by design and by being inspired by nature that this has been created. So it's not really an accident that they're orchids. They're taking inspiration from the world around them. And I think it's really cool how they do that. Even if some folks might think that the imaginative orchids as being a neutralizing agent for deployment against threats is kind of weird or silly. It's cool, man. It's just another way that they're showing us, and I really actually like it after learning more about orchids from some of my plant friends. So TLDR, I think it's dope. I'm firmly on Team Orchid at this point. I also want to talk to you guys about Coppelia. So Coppelia is a ballet, And it is about some folks in a town who are preparing for the Harvest Festival. And it is celebrating a gift of a bell by someone who is the town councilor and his wife. So everybody's really stoked about this party, more or less. And then the celebration is interrupted by Dr. Coppelius. And Dr. Coppelius is this lonely old alchemist. So not just a scientist, specifically an alchemist. He's trying to turn one type of material into another, very much like the folks on this planet are trying to do with creating organic, inorganic life forms. So he's trying to create life in this way. So Dr. Coppelius is very similar. He's an old alchemist, and he lives in this big house on the edge of the village square, and everyone kind of thinks of him as being a sorcerer or a mad scientist in a way. So a lot of folks are scared of him, and they also make fun of him. Coppelia is his daughter, and it's really a mechanical doll. It's not a real person, but this mechanical doll is so lifelike that many of the villagers are really fooled into thinking she's actually alive. And Dr. Coppelius is so obsessed with this doll that he tries to bring her to life using magic. So this is more or less the gist of the story that you need to know. Everything goes sideways for Coppelius, and the people who were screwed over by him at the beginning end up fine. That's the TLDR of this ballet. But if you're interested in it, it's called Coppelia. And we have a lot of parallels with this ballet and this episode of Star Trek Picard. So we have the folks like Bruce Maddox, who would really be considered like mad scientists, who are out here doing science in secret and creating organic, inorganic life forms. This man is out here trying to create the singularity, you guys, and he has really achieved it with Soji and Daj. So he and anyone else he may be working with can both be symbols of Dr. Coppelius, and they are obsessed with this creation of life and the creations that they have made. So in this case, it does also seem very similar in some ways to Frankenstein, the postmodern Prometheus, but it is also in a very different strain. Coppelia almost has a feeling like it's a ballet that perhaps Shakespeare would have written regarding some of the almost comedies of errors that occur due to people thinking that Coppelia is actually human and not just a mechanical doll. And in that way, it's like if Shakespeare wrote Frankenstein as a ballet, perhaps, that's kind of where Coppelia is at that point. But I really love this concept. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about how that plays into this episode of Star Trek Picard. Stay tuned.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the concepts of orchids and what we can really learn from them about perhaps where Star Trek Picard is taking the story with the sense, as well as the ballet Coppelia. So remember, this planet of Soji's homeworld is named Coppelius, and Coppelius is a mad scientist who has created a mechanical daughter, and he's obsessed with trying to make her real. So there's also some Pinocchio in here as well, I suppose. There's a lot of intersections in the concept of Coppelia with other types of literature or other forms of literature. This here is a ballet. Perhaps since we're all in social distancing, it will be one of the free ballets online at a certain point that we can all watch together. But very similar to how in Stargate SG1, they have Jack go rogue on everyone in Season 3's episode Shades of Grey. And when he meets with Mayborn, it's playing Pagliacci in the background. It's playing The Clown, Il Pagliacci. And it is an opera. We've already established that Jack likes opera music, but he is listening to this specifically while he's hanging out on his deck, knowing that Mayborn is going to come by. He knows it's coming. He's waiting on it. He is, in fact, depending on it in order for his Black Ops mission to go well. But he is playing the clown at that point. It's very symbolic, especially if you read the backstory of what Pagliacci is about. So even if we are mostly into sci-fi, we can get a lot more out of sci-fi from checking out ballets, Broadway plays, especially if you're into the Orville. Seth MacFarlane is very into musicals. I think we all saw that a lot in Family Guy, but he also gives it some really loving treatment in his show The Orville as well, which is also his love letter to Star Trek. I really enjoy it. If you don't like Discovery, but you did like TNG, even in all of the silly episodes, then you might really enjoy The Orville. It's going to take you on an emotional roller coaster. But my overall point is that there are more jokes in these sci-fis that we're watching that have to do with ballet and with other forms of art to which we might not typically tend to follow. So I think it's really fun to go and seek it out. I think I'm going to watch Coppelia soon. I also really love that it is specifically a ballet. That implies something about grace and the flow of the story and the characters therein. And it almost conveys to me a sense of unfolding, which also makes a lot of sense in context with the orchids. That's also where we are in this story. It's an unfolding of all of the events that have been laid out before us. So we know that with Coppelia, it's going to be perhaps a little bit more complicated than everyone thinks going in. We have to wait for things to unfold because what is initially happening and believed to be what's truly going on, what's on the surface, is not necessarily what it seems. Not everything is necessarily as it seems, is kind of the message of Coppelia. So in this case, we have our folks who have just reached the planet. Those orchids take them down like a stone, you guys. It's a very rough landing for everyone involved. That includes the La Sirena, Narek and his ship, and the artifact, which appeared out of nowhere pretty much in that Borg conduit. So they are now on this planet that her people are from and should be there, according to their scans. But also, she has brought Narek and a Borg cube straight to them. So this is really not great. This is not ideal for what Soji wants. And she's having kind of a crisis of conscience about this, in which she is kind of beating herself up about leading these folks straight to her home because she was so excited to get there that she didn't think through a lot of the stuff. And I think that is really great in underlying her humanity. She feels guilt, and she also let her emotions override her logical processes. So she is very much human. She is organic in the way that she can produce mucus, yes, but also that she lets her emotions get the best of her, which is something Data, I think, would be so in awe of in a way, and that's really what he was going for. So I think that small component is also just very beautiful. She also has the very human concept of regret, and I think that they did a great job in laying that out. Now, we haven't heard much up to this point, really, about whatever's going on with Picard's brain. And we just know that he's not as young as he used to be. And so we see him sometimes seeming to have a little bit of trouble with his health. And I think that's mostly meant to remind us about the brain thing. But it's really difficult to communicate the concept that something is wrong with someone's brain in a way in which it's not impacting an area that is associated with their body movements per se. So I get why a lot of folks are like, what happened to the brain thing? Well, I think they were trying to show us, but contextually, it's, I think, kind of hard to pick up on unless you're going the stroke route, and that's not the direction they were going with this. He has an abnormality in his brain, and you know, it's Star Trek, you guys. They're living in the future. He has a miracle geneticist, more or less, on this ship with him, even if she murdered the other guy. And they could be fine. But he goes ahead and admits that to everyone as they have crashed. And he's like, look, this is what's going on. Don't make a big deal out of this, or I'm going to get mad at you, but I'm totally dying of this brain abnormality, and we're not sure how long it's going to take, but I did have a seizure as we were landing. You guys were correct. So that's what's up. And he does a really good job in being honest about it and being just vulnerable enough, but still being classic Picard, where he is really using some of his stoicism as a crutch. This is a hard conversation for him to have out loud for himself, in addition to directly speaking to these people that he cares about to all kinds of varying degrees and in varying contexts. So he is going, hey, I've got some bad news. I'm glad that we're here and we all survived that crash, but yes, I am going to die. And everyone looks kind of upset about it, which is very good, I think. Even though he tells them that he does not want any big displays of emotion and stuff, I love that they do it anyway. So they're kind of in shock at first, but you can see that folks are shaken, and this is something really rough for them to come to grips with, despite how angry Rafi may have been with him at the beginning, and despite how little Soji truly knows him, and despite how little he probably knows Rios as well at this point. So it's a lot that's going on for these characters, but he's at least gotten this all out in the open. And I like that he's able to do that. I'm not sure how old Picard would have said that if he would have admitted it at all. We all know how he was about his heart problem with his artificial heart, having gotten in that fight with a Nausicaan and having to get an artificial heart at a certain point. But he pretty much let that one ride until it was absolutely failing. So I like that he's just a little bit more open than he used to be. He's not gushing, but he is the teensiest bit more open, and I love this slightly squishier version of Picard. We're going to go on another break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about the trek to the artifact and finding Soji's original family.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Before the break, we were talking about Picard finally admitting that he has a terminal diagnosis only after he actually had a seizure in front of everyone, and everyone was very concerned about him, so it really required an explanation. The man is still reticent. He's just a little bit more open with his emotions. After his announcement, Picard pretty much walks off, and everyone is trying to see whether they can get the ship back up and running. There is no way. So they decide they have to go check out the artifact that went down, see exactly who all is in there, who the survivors are, whether Elnor is still present since they left him there, and whether or not they are going to be able to scavenge anything from it to get their ship running. So everyone decides to go together. They are giving Soji the option of splitting up and half of them going with her to meet her people because that's in the opposite direction, and the other half going to the artifact. But she decides she wants to stick with them right now, and she's going to go with them to the artifact, and then they can all go together to meet her people. It's a very nice moment, and it gives you kind of an idea of roughly where Soji's loyalties lie at this point, too. She perhaps is also relying on them for some emotional support, because this is something big she's about to go through. She's starting to remember things, but she doesn't remember everything. So they go on this long walk over to the artifact and are able to run the long-range scanners and see that a bunch of Romulan warbirds are on their way. So Narek probably let them know, and also when 7 of 9 absconded with the artifact, that probably gave it away to a lot of the Romulans. So we are glad at this point to reunite Elnor and 7 of 9 with the rest of the group. Everyone is very happy and relieved to see Elnor, and surprised but happy to see 7. So we are finding out that there is more bad news bears coming, and Elnor wants to go ahead and talk to Picard before they part again. And it's very sweet how it goes. And it's because the others went ahead and told him about the terminal diagnosis, because it felt like Picard might not. And so the others do their buddy a solid, and they tell Elnor and 7 of 9, and the others are kind of heading out a little bit ahead, and Picard's like, give me a minute, I'll be there in a minute. And he is talking to Elnor, and he tells him that he's very proud of him. And it's such an important moment for Picard as well as for Elnor. And he looks so happy, Elnor does, to get this praise from someone who is like kind of a father figure to him in a way. So it's someone he looks up to, and it's very sweet. It's not "I love you," and it's not a hug, but it is very paternal and very sweet to see between the two of them. So Picard leaves Elnor with 7, trying to get as much as they can online, and we also see that Narissa made it in the crash, so she's already there, just kind of slinking around the artifact. It is On now, though, to the place where Soji is from. So where they see the cluster of life forms that are on the planet. They go ahead and head over there. And Rafi has taken to calling it Synthville. So it is home to a bunch of synthetic life forms and a man who says he's Dr. Alton Inigo Sung. And he outright says that he is a mad scientist. He looks almost exactly like Dr. Noonien Sung, so that means he also looks almost exactly like Data / almost exactly like Lore at that point. So it's pretty cool to see how they still incorporated Brent Spiner into the show without having to negate Data's sacrifice from before. So it's done very well, in my opinion, and he is really kind of confusing Picard at first, because also he looks like Noonien Sung. He has organic type of skin, and he says that he is Noonien Sung's biological child, and that he and his father look very similar to each other and to Data. They pretty much hang a lantern on it and keep on going. And I'm here for it. It's cool. It didn't come off as cheesy at all. I really enjoyed how they brought him across. I was delighted to see Brent Spiner playing another character in this universe, and he did a fantastic job. So we also see that Soji is starting to remember things the more she comes in contact with the other synths. So she's getting this flood of memories that is coming in waves, and she knows Arcana's name without being told. So she recognizes some of the other people in this town, some of the other synths. And then Soji sees Sutra, and Sutra looks exactly like Soji, except she has gold skin and yellow eyes. And she recognizes Sutra immediately. So Sutra is Jana's twin, and Soji was Daj's twin, but they do also look very similar to these other ones. However, most of the rest of the androids do look different, in fact. So they're in pairs, of course, as well, but they don't all look like Soji. So it's only Sutra and Soji that are alive at this point. They look similar to each other, and we can tell them apart because Sutra has golden skin and yellow eyes, and she also acts significantly different from Soji. She acts like she's a yoga guru or something, is the vibe that I get. So Sutra is really interesting as a character, and she seems to keep a lot of information close to the vest. She also suggests that it might not be Agnes's fault that she killed Bruce. It might rather be that she was brainwashed more or less to do it. So this is really interesting for everyone else, and Agnes essentially has this look on her face like, dear God, please let that be true, because this guilt is ravaging this girl. And so Sutra says that the pitiful Romulans may have been messing with her head, and that she was trying to grapple with the meaning of a message that her organic brain was not meant to process or understand in any way. It wasn't even meant to come into contact with it, is Sutra's theory. And I think it's really interesting how she speaks about the Romulans. So she has kind of a disdain and a superiority to her in talking about them. So she's calling them pitiful. And it comes across as both being derisive and also very dismissive, as though they are beneath her and therefore something she doesn't really need to worry about that much. Kind of like they're ants is almost the sense that you get. It's not overtly very malicious, but it tells us a little bit about Sutra, and it also poses more questions for us regarding her alignment and where she stands, even if she is on the side of Soji at this point. That does not necessarily mean she is good. And I like that they're keeping this complex. So Sutra recommends that she performs a mind meld with Agnes in order to retrieve this information that the pitiful Romulans showed to Agnes. She wants to see the same vision that Agnes saw. Now, the mind meld looked kind of frightening, and Agnes was correspondingly terrified, and we get to see that just like Soji, Sutra can look at someone's facial expression and tell from her programming what type of emotions and such they're going through and whether or not they're telling the truth. So that's what we're presenting right now as Sutra looks at Agnes and tells her that she's obviously very scared and it's not going to hurt. So they go ahead and mind meld, which is absolutely fascinating to watch a synthetic life form mind meld with an organic one. In regards to the singularity and humanity, I mean, what further evidence could we see at this point that these creatures do have humanity in that really organic sense? Someone who was an android like Data, who was not capable of emotion and stuff like that, would not be able to do this, I don't think. Remember how much Data struggled with playing the violin, because so much of the violin comes from the emotion, and he knew that as much as he could play with precision, it wasn't going to necessarily sound the same as what he liked to listen to, because it was artificially made and it didn't have heart, more or less, inside of it. And that's really Data's thing, as he's their version of the Tin Man, if he only had a heart, and that's all he wants. So I like how they have done a lot of this literary mirroring in here, and it's so well-rounded and pulled from such diverse areas of literature that it really fleshes out the narrative, in my opinion. And we see that in Agnes's memory that it seems that there used to be some very big deal synthetic life forms that had their own alliance, kind of like the Federation perhaps, and that the humans tried to kill them before, and so the synths went ahead and turned on them and killed all of the humans, and that they knew that that might happen again in the future. So they were warning other types of synthetic life forms that may arrive in the future, that if they ever needed them to come in and wipe out humanity, that they would. So we see that, again, one person's villain or doomsday event is another person's salvation or cavalry. And we're just seeing both sides of this war. We just happen to start on the side of the Romulans, not necessarily in agreeing with them, but going, hey, you know, that you're right, that does look really bad. And now we're seeing a different interpretation from the opposite side. And I think it's really interesting how Sutra interprets that and how she processes it, in comparison to how the Zhat Vash do that. And it's again on another dichotomy of being organic versus inorganic, and being considered illegal and a secret citizen of the entire galaxy, really. And now that's juxtaposed with being someone who had a hand in making that illegal and who is committed fully to hunting you down. So it's also drawing those lines of the oppressor and the oppressed for this semiotic square, as we discussed the other day. And it is just outstanding how the authors, the writers, and the directors of the show have really gone through and layered these squares. So we're seeing that Sutra is also in a position of power on this planet. A lot of folks defer to her, and when they arrive, it isn't the doctor who is waiting for them. It's not Alton per se. He's just hanging out front, but he really takes them to go have an audience with Sutra. And it's not necessarily super blatant because she's not laying on a pile of pillows or anything, but in retrospect, you can tell who wears the pants in Synthville. All right, we are going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how this episode ends.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing how Sutra did a mind meld with Agnes and saw, in her opinion, that there was an alliance of synthetic life that claimed they would come to help the synths if the organics ever tried to ban/destroy them again. So with the Romulan warbirds on their way, this is very much a Gandalf arriving at dawn on the third day for the synths in this situation. This is their potential cavalry, their salvation, and they had no idea that this individual was going to pop up, or this group rather was going to pop up. And they are talking about how organics perceive this perfection of synthetic life forms as a threat. And they're right about that. They get into how with humans, to be human is to die. And that is not the case with the synths. And again, it's a question of humanity. Is that what makes humanity? Or in this case, organics? Is it something that is innately in you, like a spirit? Or is it enough that these creatures are able to have mucus and everything? Do they have to be able to die in order to be human? In fact, it is that they do not die that makes humans uncomfortable with the concept of these synthetic life forms. They make these creations that then outlast them. And it's very much antithetical to what humans are programmed to want. And that would be passing on their genes. Speaking strictly from a biological perspective, they want to pass their genes on into the future. And it is unnerving for the organics at this point to be seeing that the synths aren't going to die like them. And that goes back to that tragic sense of life and how knowing that you're going to die really frames how people live. According to Miguel de Unamuno, that is the tragic sense of life, knowing that you will die. So we're really getting to the underlying component of this fear and almost, I would call it, xenophobia against the synths at this point. They feel as organics that they've made something that they cannot control that will outlive them and therefore outcompete them in every way. And so it makes them scared. And when humans are scared, they are panicky, dangerous animals. So the organics perceiving the synths as being a threat is quite logical, as Spock would perhaps point out. But that is, I think, largely the reason behind it. It is just a matter of being outcompeted. The Zhat Vash believe that the synths are going to bring the destroyer, who Ramda thought to be Soji. And remember that when Ramda met Soji, she said, "You're the twin, but are you the one who lives or the one who dies? Are you the destroyer?" And so now we've seen Sutra as well. So we know that Jana is Sutra's sister, and that Jana was killed by Captain Rios's former commander, and that he knows for a fact that she's dead. So now we have two of these twins, and they have separate twins who have died. So they're actual twin copies that were made from the same positronic cells in Data. So now we have a new potential interpretation for this specific prophecy that the Romulans have laid out. It could go either way. And Sutra does seem to be rather untrustworthy, you guys. And she kind of creeps you out a little bit. And it's on the one hand, like, is it because of the excessive android components, like the uncanny valley kind of thing, or is it because she's actually evil? And it's because she's actually kind of evil, is how it turns out for us. So, surprise, it's not the mirror universe, so there are no mustaches, but we know that Sutra is kind of predatory. And she actually releases Narek in this episode. She goes in, and she's hypersexualized as well, I guess because she's evil. There are some things that Star Trek has really progressed on through the years, and making everyone who is evil hypersexual or pansexual / bisexual still tends to be something that they do for evil characters to show us that they're evil. So there's that. That's part of why folks like the Doctor so much in Star Trek Discovery, because it's not a feature of them being evil that is tied to them being gay. Although we still have Philippa Georgiou, who is very much pansexual and very, very evil. So she's kind of the emperor of the mirror universe. So they're still doing that, and that's not ideal, but they have an opportunity to do more with that in the future. So if you have more people who are good guys or even just middle ground people, that would be really great if they also were pansexual or bisexual, so that you have a lot of characters that show different facets of humanity who are same gender loving. And that would be really cool, because I love Philippa Georgiou. I absolutely love her. I love bad guys, and I like seeing representation with bad guys too. It's only a problem if the only representation you have is all in bad guys. So I think that that is something that's really important for them to consider going forward. And overall, I like Sutra as a character. She's definitely evil, and she even kills one of her own sisters in the process. So Saga doesn't look exactly like her, but they're all technically siblings. They're all from Data's positronic cells, so they're technically related. But she kills one of her own at this point, and she, in that, enacts betrayal, which is a very human type of concept, I think. And they explore this a lot in Stargate SG1 as well, with the character Fifth, one of the replicators who had a thing for Sam. And Sam believed in the goodness in him and wanted to try to save him. But Jack made her leave Fifth behind after she promised not to. And that really bites them in the butt down the line. And like in a big way. And she's upset about it. And the episode ends with her saying that Fifth had learned betrayal from her, And so she felt that she was at fault for having taught that to the replicators to begin with, because now as they take on emotion, it can really go sideways with how those synthetic life forms were acting. So in this form of the singularity, much like the human form replicators, Sutra has her own agenda, and she goes ahead and sets Narek loose, saying that she wasn't sure if she'd be able to wait long enough because she wanted to just kill him because she was angry. But on the other hand, she needed him. So she kills Saga to kind of frame Narek for it and sets Narek loose and tells him, hey, go kill everybody on the planet. Whatever, do what you want to do. I don't care anymore, is pretty much where Sutra's at this point. Because it's not important what he does next. It's only important that he's loose so that she can frame him and further her own means. And she's also just, in her mind, making a hard choice. And she's decided she's going to stand with her people and put the sense first. And it's very similar to Agnes's situation and her own. So Soji is trying to work through whether she should go ahead and be part of this choice that Sutra wants to make, but she knows that there are some inherent issues with it, and that protecting one group of her friends means that it very well may be the absolute downfall and desolation of the others. So she tries to kind of talk to Picard about it, and he is telling her that if she can't find an alternative, then that is a failure of imagination, which is kind of a blow regarding being human as well. So we have this theme again with the betrayal, and also Picard letting her know, use your imagination. It's not just thinking all the time. You need to utilize some creativity. In a way, depending on how you look at it, because as Obi-Wan says, everything's true from a certain point of view, he almost seems to be insulting her and telling her that she's not human enough, which could really put some lemon juice on her wounds that she has about learning that she is synthetic, even if she seems really jazzed about it right now with her family. But she also is really getting a reminder of how human he thinks she is. So he's telling her essentially what Deanna told him, and that is that he knows that she can do better, and he knows that she has the human capacity of creativity and of reconciliation to go through and not just pursue this logically, but also work out how to save both groups of people. It's a very Picard outcome, and it's nice to see how he is really being someone she's turning to for advice at this point. She doesn't pledge that she's going to take his advice, but she goes to consult him after something kind of feels off in her gut about what Sutra is saying, and it's just making her uncomfortable. So Picard is then confronted by Sutra and the others, and she says she's going to call the higher power sense. And Picard's like, let me just take you away in my ship, and we will get you inducted into the Federation and go from there. But Alton has some not so great contributions to the conversation, and he reminds them that Picard tried before to prevent synths being illegal, and that didn't work. Like, why would the Federation listen to him now? And so it largely sways them into arresting Picard to keep him from interrupting any of their plans. And Soji doesn't look excited about that or happy about it, but she complies. And then Agnes says that she's finally where she belongs and she wants to help out. And so Sutra looks her in the eye and says, you know, you are essentially the closest thing any of us has to a mother, because of her research with Bruce Maddox. And they're like, a mother would die for her children. Would you die for yours? And Agnes looks her dead in the eye and says yes. And so Sutra gives her rein to walk around. And that is where we end this episode. I really like this episode as well, and I'm stoked that it is a 2-parter. We will wrap this up in a future episode. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.